All right, let's begin with the top story we are tracking on World DNA, which is coming from Russia.
Right, Rohit. More than 78 years ago, the Nazis surrendered to Allied forces with the signing of the Instrument of Surrender in the outskirts of Berlin. Nazi Germany, it accepted defeat at the hands of the Soviet Union and other Allied powers.
Yes, now to commemorate that event, Moscow is awash with red flags, St. George's ribbons and other Second World War related symbols. It's Victory Day in Russia and some other former Soviet nations. The stage is set for the annual parade on the Red Square. Security has been beefed up in the capital. All eyes are now on the grand event in Moscow, which begins in a few hours from now, and all ears on President Putin's speech.
Now, the Russian military holds a parade at Moscow's Red Square and in other cities to mark the event. An elaborate ceremony also takes place at the tomb of the unknown soldier, the memorial in Moscow dedicated to Soviet soldiers who died during the war. 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war, which is the greatest for any country. Other Allied powers celebrate May 8th as Victory in Europe Day. The erstwhile USSR, however, wanted to wait till the official document was signed by German authorities in Soviet-controlled Berlin. By the time the document was signed, it was already past midnight in Moscow. Russia, therefore, celebrates Victory Day on the 9th of May. The occasion, however, was not always celebrated with the kind of pomp and glory that we see today. It was only in 1965 that a USSR leader made May 9th a national holiday. And around the same time, grand celebrations and military parades were introduced to mark Victory Day. But it is President Vladimir Putin who's often credited with elevating the scale of the event to its present form. Under Vladimir Putin, Victory Days become a show of strength of troops and military hardware. But reports say this time the war in Ukraine has prompted officials across Russia to scale back the celebrations. But the country's biggest parade outside the Kremlin on the Red Square, it's still expected to be a show of raw military might. It is set to display row-upon-row of carefully choreographed soldiers marching amid weapons ranging from vintage tanks to intercontinental ballistic missiles. Will it be different this time? That's the question everyone is asking.
Now, for more on this, we were joined by Glenn Diesen from Oslo in Norway. Glenn is a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway. Thanks, sir, for speaking to us. It's been a turbulent week ahead of the Victory Day celebrations in Russia. You know, there's unease over these celebrations this year amid fears of strikes. There have been setbacks. There have been certain amount of positives as well. How is the Victory Day in 2023, which is this year, today, going to be different from the previous times?
Well, the main difference is that Russia is currently in a war. And a military parade, by definition, is a concentration of personnel and military hardware. So it would be a very attractive target for the Ukrainians. And also it would be a quite a humiliating hit for the Russians if it would happen. So for this reason, given that we're currently at war, I would expect that the 9th of May celebration would have to reflect this reality, which means more security and also less exposure of its troops, but also limiting the exposure of political leaders, especially now following the recent drone attacks on the Kremlin. And there's also a people's initiative of the past few years, which is that people carry, picture of their relatives which fought and died in the Second World War to defeat Nazi Germany. So I guess this year there would also be a lot of pictures of, the dead youth who died recently, which could make also this 9th of May commemoration even more intense.
Right, Professor Diesen. Also, what sort of a turning point in the Russia-Ukraine war can we expect with the Victory Day celebrations, if at all?
Well, I don't think the Victory Day on its own would make a turning point. Well, in the Ukrainian political commentary, there's been a lot of attention given to not allowing Bakhmut to fall before the 9th of May, as this will be a symbolic victory for Ukraine in order to hold it on this day, which would also make Washington happy, which is also a priority in Kyiv. Now, but after 9th of May, it may be more likely that Ukraine pulls out, as the position it's currently holding in Bakhmut is not tenable. They're suffering immense amount of casualties in order to hold a city which they effectively already lost. So they might attempt to pull out and let this city fall after 9th of May. But unrelated to the 9th of May celebration, I expect that the war would nonetheless enter a different stage, simply because both sides are planning a major spring offensive. So this is a war of attrition, and Russia has destroyed much of the Ukrainian army and the NATO army, which has, the NATO weapons, which has been pumped into this war over the past year. So now that the ground is drying up and hardening, which is important there as there's so much mud, I expect Russia to make a major offensive within the next few weeks. And this would, with all these forces it has accumulated. So I would expect the war to enter a new stage, but I wouldn't relate it directly to the 9th of May.
Sir, you know, Victory Day down the years has gradually emerged as the centerpiece of President Putin's vision of Russian identity over 2 decades that he's been in charge. How is that expected to reflect in this year's Victory Day address?
I think this war is, especially as Russia is a war again, is as relevant as it has ever been. But it's also worth remembering that the Soviet Union lost about 27 million people to defeat Nazi Germany and liberate Europe. So every Russian family was devastated, and this has a huge influence on the identity of the Russians, much like the Holocaust would have a huge influence on the Jewish identity. But it's also worth remembering that remembering the Soviet victory in the Second World War is important for the continuity within Russia's national consciousness. Keep in mind that Putin is a conservative, and a key challenge is therefore how do you conserve something from the Soviet era, which was a revolutionary communist state which no longer exists. Well, the solution becomes you salvage the achievements of that period, you know, the sacrifices, the suffering, and the victories. So the Second World War is definitely a key piece of the Soviet history, which is worth preserving, which is why it's also an important component to keep some historical continuity and not allow these 7 decades to simply be a blank hole in the national history. And lastly, I would just add, as Russia now considers itself to fight an existential war vis-a-vis NATO primarily, the remembrance of this great fight against Nazi Germany, I think, would be even more important in terms of bringing people together and creating a unifying national narrative and a national identity.